I was
Charles, that's
standing in my
enough.
own living room when my son laughed and told
What?
everyone I
I'm
had
just
given
saying
up
what
on my
everyone else is
dreams
thinking
years
here.
ago. Not quietly, not kindly, laughed. Mom just chose the easy life, Daniel said, raising his glass. Some people stop chasing things when they realize they can't win. And everyone
The
nodded.
truth is, none
Even
of this
Emily.
would be possible if we
I
hadn't
didn't
left him
argue.
behind.
I didn't defend myself. Because upstairs, behind a locked door, none of them had ever opened, was proof that I had never stopped. I just stopped explaining. And when they finally found it, my unfinished project, it didn't just change how they saw me. It changed everything they thought they knew about this family. If you've ever been misunderstood by the people you love, I'd really like to hear your story. Like this video if it speaks to you, and consider subscribing if you want to follow what happened next. And tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I'll be reading your comments. I don't think my children remember me the way I remember myself. To them, I have always been Mom. The one who stayed, the one who cooked dinner at 5:30 sharp, who showed up to every school event, who never missed a birthday, who always said, "It's okay, honey," even when it wasn't. But there was a time, long before Daniel learned how to tie his shoes, before Emily cried over her first broken heart, when I had a name that existed outside of this house. Frances Millbrook. Not Mom, not Grandma, just Frances. And I had a dream. I used to sit by the window in my tiny apartment in Columbus, Ohio, with a notebook balanced on my knees, writing stories that felt bigger than the life I was living. I truly believed that one day my words would matter to someone. Back then, I didn't think about mortgages or grocery bills, or the quiet kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after years of putting everyone else first. Then I met Robert. He had this steady presence about him. Not flashy, not loud, but safe. He made promises that felt like shelter. And when he asked me to move with him to a small town outside Dayton, I told myself something that would shape the rest of my life. You can always come back to your dream later. Later. That word is dangerous. It stretches out in front of you like an endless road until one day you realize you've walked so far away from where you started, you can't even see it anymore. Or at least that's what it looks like from the outside. Daniel was born a year after we moved. Emily came 3 years later. Life filled up quickly after that: doctor appointment, school runs, scraped knees, late-night fevers. Robert worked long hours, and I told myself it made sense for one of us to stay home. So I stayed. At first, I kept writing. Little things. Notes in the margins of grocery lists. Half-finished paragraphs tucked into drawers. But every time I tried to sit down and focus something, or someone needed me. Mom. Frances. Can you help me with this? And I would close the notebook. Just for now, I'd say. Just for now turned into months. Then years. I don't regret raising my children. I want to be very clear about that. If I had to go back and choose again, I would still choose them. But I wish someone had told me that choosing one thing doesn't have to mean erasing another. Because somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing me as someone who had chosen and started seeing me as someone who had failed. It didn't happen all at once. It was small at first. Daniel at 16, rolling his eyes when I mentioned a book I used to love. You always say you wanted to write, Mom, but you never did. I laughed it off. Emily in college, casually telling a friend on the phone, my mom just stayed home. She never really had a career. I pretended not to hear. Even Robert, God, I love that man, sometimes looked at me with a kind of quiet confusion in his eyes. Do you ever miss it? He asked me once, standing in the kitchen late at night while the kids were asleep. Writing, I paused longer than I should have. I don't know, I said. But that wasn't true. I knew exactly how much I missed it. I felt it every time I passed a bookstore. Every time I saw someone holding a novel and getting lost in it. Every time I sat in silence and realized I didn't recognize the sound of my own thoughts anymore. Still, life kept moving. The kids grew up. They moved out, built their own lives. And I watched them do it with a strange mix of pride and distance, because by then, they had already decided who I was. Daniel became practical sharp, always measuring success in numbers and outcomes. He respected hard work, but only the kind that could be seen and quantified. Emily became expressive emotional, but also quick to judge. She believed in dreams, but only the kind that people chased loudly and visibly. And me, I had become invisible in a very specific way. Not ignored, not unloved, just simplified. Reduced to a version of myself that was easier for them to understand. After Robert passed away, that feeling deepened. The house grew quieter. Too quiet. For the first time in decades, there was no one calling my name from another room. No one asking me to fix something, find something, be something. It was just me. And the silence. That's when something inside me shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. Like a door I had forgotten about slowly creaking open. I remember the first night clearly. I was sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing in particular, when I noticed my old notebook in the corner of a drawer. I don't even remember putting it there. My hands hesitated before I reached for it. It felt almost inappropriate, like I was touching something I no longer had the right to claim. But I opened it anyway. The pages were yellowed, the ink slightly faded. But the words were still there. My words. And as I read them, something happened that I hadn't felt in years. I recognized myself. Not the version of me that made casseroles and smiled politely at family gatherings. Not the version that nodded along when people talked about things that didn't matter to her. But the real me. Frances. I didn't cry. I didn't make any big declarations. I just picked up a pen, and I started writing again. At first, it was slow, awkward, like trying to speak a language you once knew fluently but hadn't used in years. But the more I wrote, the easier it became. And soon, writing wasn't something I did. It was something I returned to. That's when the habits began. Staying up late, closing doors, locking them. Not because I had something to hide, but because for the first time in a long time, I had something that was mine. Something fragile. Something important. Something I wasn't ready to explain. Because I already knew what they would say. Why now? Who is this for? Does it even matter? So I didn't tell them. I let them believe what they wanted. That I had given up. That I had settled. That I had stopped dreaming. Meanwhile, every night behind a closed door, I was building something piece by piece. Something bigger than they could imagine. Something that wasn't just about me. Something that would one day force them to see the truth. Even if it hurt. Especially if it hurt. Because sometimes the only way people learn who you really are is when they finally realize how wrong they've been. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people who think they know your story when they've only ever read the surface. I learned to live with that kind of loneliness slowly, the way you learn to live with an ache in your joints. You notice it at first, resist it, try to fix it, and then one day, you simply move around it without thinking. That was my life for a long time, especially during the years when everything depended on me. After Robert's company downsized in the early 2000s, we went through a period that my children barely remember, but I never forgot. He picked up temporary jobs, worked long hours, came home exhausted and quiet. The pressure on him was heavy, but it didn't disappear from me. It just shifted. I started taking on small jobs from home, editing documents, writing short pieces for local newsletters, anything that could bring in a little extra income without pulling me away from the kids. That's when I got my first real opportunity. A regional publisher had read something I wrote, a small essay buried in a community paper, and reached out. They wanted to see more. They said I had a voice that felt lived in and honest. I remember sitting at the kitchen table holding that letter in my hands, my heart beating so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. It felt like a door opening. Not wide, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to step through. They asked me to submit a manuscript. Not perfect, not finished, just something that showed what I could do. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine it. A book. My book. But life doesn't pause for your dreams to catch up. That same week, Daniel broke his arm at school. Emily came down with a fever that wouldn't go away for days. Robert picked up an overnight shift to make up for lost hours. Everything collided at once. I remember sitting up late one night, the house finally quiet, the letter still sitting on the table in front of me. I had a pen in my hand, a blank notebook open, and I was so tired, not just physically, emotionally, mentally. I stared at the page for a long time, then I closed it. Later, I whispered to myself again. I wrote back to the publisher the next morning, thanked them, told them I couldn't commit right now. They never reached out again. I didn't tell Robert. I didn't tell the kids. It felt like something too fragile to explain and too painful to revisit. That moment became one of many. Opportunities that came quietly and left quietly. Choices that looked small on the outside, but carried weight I could feel for years afterward. But here's the part my children never understood. I didn't stop wanting it. I just stopped showing it. Because every time I tried to hold on to that part of myself, something else demanded to be held tighter. Daniel's future, Emily's stability, Robert's pride. So I adjusted. I became the person they needed, reliable, present, steady. And in doing that, I became someone they assumed had never been anything else. Years passed. The kids grew into adults, strong ones in their own ways. Capable, independent, exactly what I had hoped for. But independence has a way of rewriting history. Suddenly, all the invisible things you did to get them there disappear. One afternoon, a few years after Daniel got his first job in finance, he sat across from me at this very same kitchen table. "You know what I admire most, Mom?" he said. I smiled, expecting something warm. "That you were always okay with just being here," he continued. "You didn't need more." I remember blinking at him, unsure how to respond. Not everyone can accept that, he added. Some people chase things their whole lives and never find peace. He thought he was complimenting me. And maybe in his mind, he was. But all I heard was something else. You didn't need more. I wanted to ask him how he knew what I needed. I wanted to tell him about the letter, about the nights I sat awake with stories in my head that had nowhere to go, about the quiet decisions that shaped his life more than he would ever realize. But I didn't. Because by then, I understood something important. Explaining yourself to someone who has already decided who you are rarely changes anything. Emily was different, but not in a way that made it easier. She was emotional, expressive, but also quick to form conclusions. She believed in passion, in bold moves, in people who chased their dreams loudly. And because she never saw me do that, she assumed I never had. "Mom, you should try something new," she told me once, standing in my living room with her arms crossed. Join a club. Take a class. Do something that's just for you. I smiled. I'm fine, sweetheart. No, you're comfortable, she corrected. That's different. Comfortable. That word again. It followed me around like a label I couldn't peel off. Even Jason, her husband, added his opinions without hesitation. At a family dinner after a few drinks, he leaned back in his chair and said, I mean, no offense, Francis, but you've had it pretty easy, right? No corporate stress, no deadlines, just home life. I remember the way the room went quiet for a second, not because anyone was shocked, but because no one thought it was worth correcting. I nodded politely. Something like that, I said. Because what was the point? How do you explain decades of invisible labor to someone who measures value in titles and paychecks? How do you describe the weight of choices no one else had to make? You don't. You let them believe what they want, and you carry the truth quietly. That's what I did, for years. But here's the part none of them saw coming. Silence doesn't mean stillness. While they were building their lives, making their judgments, defining me in ways that felt convenient, I was watching, listening, remembering. Every comment, every assumption, every moment where I was reduced to something smaller than what I knew myself to be. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Because slowly, piece by piece, those moments started to form something. Not just memories, not just pain, but purpose. The nights I spent writing weren't just about reclaiming a dream I had put on hold. They were about documenting a truth no one else was willing to see. A story that wasn't loud, but was real. And as the pages began to stack up, as the words took shape, as the project grew beyond anything I had originally imagined, I realized something that both comforted and terrified me. This wasn't just for me anymore. This was for them, whether they were ready for it or not. It started with small things. That's always how it starts when people begin to notice something is different, but they don't yet know what it is. At first, Daniel mentioned it casually. Why do you keep getting packages, Mom? He asked one afternoon, standing in the doorway while I signed for a delivery. I smiled, keeping my tone light. Just some things I ordered. He glanced at the box, then at me. You've been ordering a lot lately. I shrugged. I have more time now. That answer seemed to satisfy him, at least in the moment. But I could tell something had shifted. A seed of curiosity had been planted. Emily noticed it too, though in a different way. She was more observant when it came to emotions, to atmosphere. She didn't focus on the boxes or the late-night activity. She noticed the change in me. You seem busy, she said one evening, watching me from the kitchen while I wiped down the counter. I've always been busy, I replied. No, she said slowly. This is different. I didn't respond. Because she was right. It was different. For the first time in years, my days had a rhythm that belonged to me. Not dictated by someone else's schedule. Not shaped by someone else's needs. My mornings were quiet, filled with coffee and notes scribbled on yellow legal pads. My afternoons were spent sorting through old documents, organizing memories, revisiting moments I had long buried. And my nights were where everything came alive. That's when I would go upstairs, close the door, lock it. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, just enough to create a boundary. At first, it was instinct, a way to protect something that felt fragile. But over time, that locked door became something else. A symbol, a line between who they thought I was and who I actually was. Olivia was the first to question it openly. She had always been different from the others. Softer in her judgments. More curious than certain. Grandma, she said one afternoon, sitting beside me on the couch, what do you do up there? I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I considered telling her the truth. But then I remembered how easily truth can be twisted when it's incomplete. I work on things, I said gently. What kind of things? Important ones. She smiled at that, but I could see the question lingering in her eyes. Unlike the others, she didn't assume. She wondered. Daniel, on the other hand, had already made up his mind. It's probably nothing. She smiled at that, but I could see the question lingering in her eyes. Unlike the others, she didn't assume. She wondered. Daniel, on the other hand, had already made up his mind. It's probably nothing, I overheard him telling Emily during one of their visits. Mom just needs something to fill her time. Like a hobby, Emily asked. Exactly, he said. Everyone needs one when they don't have, bigger responsibilities anymore. I stood in the hallway just out of sight, listening. Not because I wanted to, but because sometimes the truth about how people see you only reveals itself when they think you're not there. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them. I simply turned and walked back upstairs, closed the door, and locked it. That night, I wrote longer than usual. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because every assumption they made, every dismissive comment, every moment where they reduced my life to something small, it all became material. Not in a cruel way, but in an honest one. I wasn't writing to punish them. I was writing to preserve something they had overlooked. Something they had lived inside but never truly seen. The project was growing faster than I had expected. What began as scattered notes had turned into chapters, chapters into sections, sections into something that started to resemble a complete story. But it wasn't just a story. It was layered, part memoir, part record, part truth. There were pages filled with memories, moments of quiet sacrifice of decisions made in silence of paths not taken so that others could move forward. There were also documents, real ones, bank statements, property records, letters Robert had written me before he passed, notes about decisions we had made together, financial, legal, personal, things the children had never asked about, things they assumed had always just worked themselves out. But they hadn't. I had worked them out, carefully, quietly, over years, protecting what Robert and I had built, ensuring that no matter what happened, our children would have something stable to stand on, even if they never realized where it came from. And that realization that they didn't know, didn't ask, didn't even consider it became one of the driving forces behind the project. Because if I didn't write it down, if I didn't document it, then one day it would disappear. And with it, the truth of who I had been. The tension in the house started to build slowly. Not explosive, not dramatic, but noticeable. Emily began dropping by more often sometimes without calling first. Just wanted to check on you, she would say, but her eyes always drifted toward the staircase. Daniel started asking more pointed questions. What exactly are you working on? He pressed one afternoon, his tone sharper than before. Something meaningful, I replied. He frowned. For who? I held his gaze for a moment. For me, I said. That answer didn't sit well with him. I could see it. Because in his world, things only held value if they were tied to an outcome, a measurable result, a clear purpose that others could understand. Doing something simply because it mattered to you was not something he respected. Jason, of course, had his own interpretation. At a family dinner, he chuckled and said, "Careful, or Francis is going to come out with a surprise bestseller none of us saw coming." The table laughed, lightly, casually, as if the idea itself was absurd. I smiled along with them. But inside, something shifted. Not hurt, not anger, something quieter. Resolve. because for the first time, I realized something important. They weren't trying to be cruel. They simply couldn't imagine me as anything more than what they had already decided I was. And that meant one thing. No explanation I gave them would ever be enough. They didn't need words. They needed proof. And proof takes time. So I kept writing, kept organizing, kept building something they would one day have no choice but to confront. Even if they weren't ready. Especially if they weren't ready. Because sometimes the truth doesn't wait for permission. It reveals itself when the moment demands it. And that moment was getting closer than any of us realized. The moment that stayed with me, the one that still echoes when the house is too quiet, happened on a Sunday evening. Daniel had insisted on hosting. "It's been too long," he said over the phone. "We should all get together. Like old times." I almost laughed when he said that. Old times. People love the idea of old times because they remember them the way they want them to be. They remember them the way they want to. Softened, simplified, edited. But I agreed. Of course I did. Because no matter how much distance had grown between us, they were still my children. And some part of me, no matter how quiet it had become, still hoped for something different. The house was full when I arrived. Emily was already there setting dishes on the table. Jason stood in the kitchen with Daniel talking about investments numbers, things that sounded important but felt distant from me. Olivia was the only one who came to greet me properly. "Grandma," she said, hugging me tightly. "I'm glad you came. I wouldn't miss it," I told her. And I meant that. Dinner started the way these things always does, small talk. Polite laughter, stories that skim the surface but never go deep enough to matter. I listened more than I spoke. That had become my role over the years. Observer, supporter, background. At some point, the conversation shifted, as it often does, to career's achievements, the visible markers of success. Daniel talked about a recent promotion. Emily shared something about a project she was passionate about. Jason added his own commentary, his tone confident, assured. And then I felt it before it happened. That subtle shift in energy. That moment when attention starts looking for a new direction. And it landed on me. "So, Mom," Daniel said, leaning back in his chair, his voice casual, but carrying just enough weight to quiet the room. "What have you been up to lately?" A simple question, but not really, because I knew what he was asking, and more importantly, I knew what he expected to hear. "Oh, I said lightly, "keeping busy." "With what?" Emily pressed her eyes, narrowing slightly. Not unkindly, but curiously, almost skeptically. I hesitated, just for a second, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I knew none of the answers I could give would fit into the version of me they had already decided on. "I've been working on something," I said finally. Jason chuckled. "A secret project," he joked, raising an eyebrow. The table laughed softly, not cruelly, but dismissively. I smiled. "You could say that." Daniel shook his head, smiling in that way that always made me feel like he was humoring me. "Mom, you don't have to make it sound mysterious." The table laughed softly, not cruelly, but dismissively. I smiled. "You could say that." Daniel shook his head, smiling in that way that always made me feel like he was humoring me. "Mom, you don't have to make it sound mysterious," he said. "It's okay if you're just enjoying your time." There it was again, that wordless assumption, that quiet reduction. Emily leaned forward slightly. "Daniel's right," she said. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You've already done your part. Done your part." As if my life had been something that ended once their needs were met. As if there was nothing left beyond that. I looked around the table, at my children, at the people I had given so much of myself to. And I realized something in that moment that was both painful and strangely freeing. They weren't trying to hurt me. They simply couldn't see me. Not fully. Not anymore. Jason raised his glass slightly. To Francis, he said with a grin, "The only person I know who managed to skip all the stress and still end up with a nice, quiet life." Laughter followed. Light. Easy. Comfortable. And that's when Daniel said it. The sentence that changed everything. "Mom just chose the easy life," he said. "Some people stop chasing things when they realize they can't win." The words hung in the air for a second longer than they should have. Not because anyone disagreed, but because something about the way he said it made it feel final. Like a conclusion that had been reached long ago. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even hurt. Something colder, clearer. I set my fork down carefully, looked at him, really looked at him. At the boy I had raised, at the man he had become. "You think I stopped?" I asked quietly. The room stilled. Daniel hesitated just for a fraction of a second. Then he shrugged. "I mean, didn't you?" Emily didn't interrupt. Jason didn't either. No one did. Because to them, the answer was obvious. I could have explained. I could have told them everything about the nights, the pages, the years of work they had never seen. But I didn't. Because suddenly, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. They weren't ready to hear it, and more importantly, words wouldn't be enough. So instead, I did something they didn't expect. I smiled, softly, calmly. "No," I said. I didn't. Silence. Real silence this time. Not the polite kind, the uncomfortable kind. Daniel frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" I held his gaze for a moment longer than usual. Then I said something that even I hadn't planned. "I never stopped," I said. "I just stopped explaining." The words landed differently. I could see it. Emily shifted in her seat. Jason let out a small, uncertain laugh, as if trying to decide whether it was a joke. Daniel didn't smile. "What are you talking about, Mom?" I leaned back slightly in my chair. For the first time that evening, I wasn't trying to make them comfortable. "You'll see," I said. And that was it. I didn't elaborate. I didn't soften it. I didn't take it back. The rest of the dinner moved on, but something had changed. The laughter didn't come as easily. The conversation felt thinner, and every now and then I caught one of them looking at me differently, not with understanding, but with curiosity, with uncertainty, with the faintest hint of doubt. And as I drove home that night, the silence in my car felt different than it had before. Not heavy, not empty, but charged. Because for the first time in years, they had heard something in my voice they couldn't immediately dismiss. And that meant one thing. The story I had been writing in silence was getting closer to being heard, whether they were ready or not. After that dinner, something settled inside me. Not the kind of silence I had lived with for years. The quiet acceptance, the gentle stepping aside. This was different. This was intentional. I stopped waiting for them to understand, and instead, I started preparing for the moment they wouldn't be able to ignore it anymore. The project became my structure. My days were no longer just full, they were purposeful. I woke up early, often before the sun had fully risen, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reviewing what I had written the night before. I made notes in the margins, circled phrases that didn't feel right, added details where memory demanded precision. Because that was the thing about this project. It wasn't just storytelling. It was accuracy. Every moment I wrote about mattered. Every decision I documented had consequences that had shaped my family's life, whether they knew it or not. I wasn't just writing a narrative. I was building a record. By the afternoon, I would move into the second phase of my work, organizing documents. I had boxes now, carefully labeled, neatly stacked. Bank records from years ago, insurance policies, property documents, letters. Robert had written me some of them deeply personal, others filled with practical discussions about money, about security, about the future we were trying to build. I handled those letters differently, slower, more carefully. Sometimes I would sit with one for a long time before adding anything to the project, because Robert had understood something my children never did. He had seen me, not just as a mother, not just as a partner, but as someone who had once had a dream and who still carried it even when it wasn't visible. "You don't have to give it up forever," he told me once years ago when the kids were still young. "Just for now," I had replied. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew for now could easily become something else. I think in his own way, he always hoped I would find my way back to it. And maybe in the quietest corners of this project I was. The nights were still the most important part. That hadn't changed. If anything, they had become more intense, because now I wasn't just writing memories, I was connecting them, building something that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's when I started the chapters that I knew would be the hardest for them to read. Not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. I wrote about the time Daniel dismissed my advice when he was younger, choosing instead to follow a path that nearly cost him everything, and how I had quietly stepped in behind the scenes to fix what I could without embarrassing him. I wrote about Emily's college years, about the financial strain she never fully understood, and the decisions I made to ensure she never had to drop out, even when it meant sacrificing things I never told her about. I wrote about Jason, too, about the first time I met him, about the moment I realized he saw value in things differently than I did, and how that difference would one day affect the way he saw me. None of it was exaggerated. None of it was bitter. It was simply true, and that made it powerful. Because truth doesn't need to be loud to be undeniable. But there was one section I kept returning to, over and over again, a part of the project that I hadn't finished yet. Not because I didn't know what to write, but because I wasn't sure if they were ready to read it. It was the final section, the one that tied everything together, the one that revealed not just what I had done, but why, and more importantly, what it meant for them. Because this project wasn't just about the past, it was about the future, their future. The documents I had gathered weren't just records of what had been. They were part of something larger, something that would directly impact their lives once I was gone. A plan, carefully constructed, legally sound, and completely invisible to them. I had worked with a lawyer quietly over the past few years. Not someone Daniel or Emily knew. Not someone connected to their circles. Someone who understood discretion. Together, we had structured everything assets, property contingencies. Not in a way that favored one child over another, but in a way that protected what mattered most, and ensured that the mistakes I had watched them make would not destroy what Robert and I had spent a lifetime building. But none of that would make sense to them without context, without understanding, without seeing the full picture of who I was and what I had done. That's why the project mattered. That's why it couldn't remain unfinished forever. But it also couldn't be rushed. Because timing was everything. The tension with the family didn't disappear. If anything, it sharpened. Daniel became more direct. "Mom, this whole mystery project thing is getting a little strange," he said one afternoon when he stopped by unexpectedly. "I'm fine," I replied calmly. "That's not what I'm saying," he insisted. "I just don't understand why you're being so secretive." I looked at him for a moment. "You don't need to understand everything right away," I said. He frowned. "That's not how things work." I almost smiled. "No," I said softly. "That's not how things have worked for you." He didn't like that answer. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way he shifted his weight slightly. But he didn't push further. But he didn't push further. Emily AP approached it differently, more emotional, more personal. "You're shutting us out," she said one evening, her voice carrying a mix of frustration and hurt. "I'm not shutting you out," approached it differently. More emotional, more personal. "You're shutting us out," she said one evening, her voice carrying a mix of frustration and hurt. "I'm not shutting you out," I replied. "It feels like you are," she insisted. "You won't tell us what's going on. You won't let us in." I took a slow breath. "Emily," I said gently, "there's a difference between being shut out and not being invited into something you haven't shown interest in before." She blinked. The words hit her, not harshly, but clearly, because the truth is, they had never asked before. Not really, not in a way that went beyond curiosity. And now that there was something they didn't understand, they wanted access. But access comes with responsibility, with readiness, with the ability to see something fully, not just react to it. And I wasn't sure they were there yet, so I kept going, kept writing, kept building, kept refining something that was no longer just a project, but a turning point, because sooner or later, that locked door upstairs would not stay closed forever. And when it opened, everything they thought they knew about me, about themselves, about this family, would have to be rewritten. The day it happened wasn't dramatic. No storm, no raised voices, no warning, just a small mistake. Or maybe something that was always meant to happen. I had to leave town for 2 days. A former neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, had taken a fall, and her daughter called to ask if I could come stay with her while she recovered. It wasn't even a question in my mind. Of course I would go. Before I left, I moved through the house the way I always did, checking windows, unplugging appliances, making sure everything was in order. And then I stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the door, the one I had kept closed for so long. I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I understood them. There's a difference. I walked upstairs, slowly opened the door, stepped inside, and looked around the room that had become something more than just a space. It was no longer just where I worked. It was where I existed fully. Stacks of paper lined the desk. Boxes were neatly arranged along the wall. My notes were spread across the surface in a system only I fully understood. I took a deep breath. Then I locked the door and slipped the key into my purse. I told myself it was enough, that it would be fine, that 2 days wasn't long enough for anything to change. But sometimes, it doesn't take long. Daniel stopped by the house the next morning. I found that out later. At the time, I was sitting beside Mrs. Caldwell's bed reading quietly while she slept. He said he had just wanted to check on things, make sure everything was okay. That's what he told himself anyway. Emily came later that afternoon. She hadn't planned to, but Daniel had called her. "I think Mom's hiding something," he said. Those words stayed with me when I heard them later. Not because they were wrong, but because of the tone behind them. Not concern, not curiosity, suspicion. They both ended up in my house at the same time. standing in the living room, looking at the same staircase they had passed by 100 times without thinking. But now, they were thinking. "What do you think she's doing up there?" Emily asked. Daniel shrugged. "Probably nothing important." But he didn't sound convinced. They went upstairs, step by step, the way people do when they're entering a space they know they weren't meant to enter. The door was locked. Of course it was. And for a moment, that could have been the end of it. A boundary respected, a line left uncrossed. But curiosity has a way of turning into something stronger when it's challenged. Something stronger when it's challenge D. Emily noticed it first. "The key," she said. "Mom always keeps a spare somewhere." Daniel hesitated. Just for a second. That was the moment where he could have walked away, where he could have decided that whatever I was doing. Emily noticed it first. "The key," she said. "Mom always keeps a spare somewhere." Daniel hesitated. Just for a second. That was the moment where he could have walked away, where he could have decided that whatever I was doing was mine. But he didn't. They searched. Not aggressively, not like intruders, but like people who believed they had a right to know. Because in their minds, they did. Olivia found it. That's what hurt the most when I learned the truth. Not because she meant any harm, but because she trusted them. "Is this it?" she asked, holding up the small brass key she had found tucked behind an old picture frame in the hallway closet. Daniel took it, and for a moment just held it. Emily watched him. "You're really going to open it?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "She's my mother," he said. "If there's something going on, we should know." That was all the justification he needed. The key turned easily in the lock. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway. A soft click. Small, but final. The door opened slowly. At first, they didn't understand what they were looking at. It wasn't what they expected. No hidden valuables, no dramatic secret, just paper. Stacks and stacks of paper. Neatly organized, carefully arranged. The room was quiet, almost reverent in its stillness. Emily stepped inside first. Her eyes moved across the desk, the shelves, the boxes. "What is all this?" she whispered. Daniel followed. He picked up a stack of pages from the desk, read the first few lines, then stopped. Because what he was reading wasn't random. It wasn't scattered notes. It was structured, intentional, a story. He flipped through more pages, faster now, scanning, searching. "What is she writing about?" Emily asked, moving closer. Daniel didn't answer right away, because he had found something, a title, typed clearly at the top of one of the documents, a title that made his expression change. "This." "What is she writing about?" Emily asked, moving closer. Daniel didn't answer right away, because he had found something. A title, typed clearly at the top of one of the documents, a title that made his expression change. This is about us," he said slowly. Emily froze. "What do you mean?" He handed her the pages. She read, and as she did, her face shifted. Confusion, then recognition, then something deeper, something heavier, because the words on those pages weren't imagined. They were real. Moments she remembered, but not like this. Not from this perspective. Not with this level of detail. "Daniel," she whispered, but he had already moved on. Opening one of the boxes, inside were folders, labeled, dated. He pulled one out, opened it, and found documents, official ones, financial records, legal papers, things he recognized but had never seen together like this. "What is she doing?" he murmured. Not dismissively, not anymore, but uncertainly. Emily sat down slowly in the chair by the desk, still holding the pages, still reading. Olivia stood in the doorway, silent, watching, feeling the shift in the room without fully understanding it. "This isn't just writing," Emily said quietly. Daniel nodded. "No," he agreed, "it's something else." He picked up another section, this one marked with a note, typed in bold letters at the top. Not finished, not yet ready for them. He stared at it for a long moment, as if trying to understand what it meant, or maybe what it implied. Because suddenly the idea that I had given up didn't fit anymore. The betrayal of me they had carried for years. He stared at it for a long moment, as if trying to understand what it meant, or maybe what it implied. Because suddenly the idea that I had given up didn't fit anymore. The version of me they had carried for years was beginning to crack, and standing in that room, surrounded by evidence they couldn't dismiss, they were faced with something they had never truly considered before, that maybe they had been wrong. And as they stood there reading pieces of a story they didn't know they were part of, one thing became clear. They hadn't just opened a door. They had stepped into something that would change how they saw everything, including me. When I came home, I knew something was wrong before I even opened the door. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The house looked the same. The lights were off just as I had left them. The air inside carried that familiar stillness of a place that had been empty for a couple of days. But something felt different, subtle, almost like a room where a conversation had ended just moments before you walked in. I stepped inside, slowly setting my bag down near the door. "Hello," I called out, even though I knew no one was there. Silence answered me. I moved through the house, my eyes scanning small details without fully understanding what I was looking for. The kitchen was untouched, the living room mostly the same, but then I noticed it, the picture frame in the hallway, slightly crooked. It was a small thing, something anyone else would have ignored, but I had placed it there myself, carefully, and I knew exactly how it was supposed to sit. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with certainty. I didn't rush upstairs. That would have been too emotional, too reactive. Instead, I walked. Slowly, deliberately. Each step measured, as if I was giving myself time to accept what I already knew. The door was closed, just like I had left it. For a moment, I stood there looking at it, at the handle, at the lock. And then I reached into my purse and pulled out the key. My hand paused before inserting it. Because there is a moment right before you confirm something you already suspect, where everything still exists in possibility. Where you can choose not to know. But I turned the key. The door opened, and I saw it immediately. The shift. The difference. Not chaos, not destruction, but disturbance. The papers on my desk were not exactly where I had left them. One of the boxes near the wall had been opened and closed again, but not quite the same way. A folder sat slightly out of place. To anyone else, it would have looked untouched, but to me, it was unmistakable. They had been here. I stepped into the room, slowly closing the door behind me. The air felt heavier, not because anything was gone, but because something had changed. The space no longer belonged only to me. I moved to the desk and picked up the stack of pages Daniel had touched. I could tell. There was a slight bend at the corner, a shift in alignment. He had read this. Emily, too. I knew that without needing proof. And Olivia. I paused at that thought, then exhaled slowly. I set the pages down carefully, walked to the box they had opened, lifted the folder, checked its contents. Everything was still there, nothing missing, which meant something important. They hadn't come to take. They had come to understand, or at least to try. I sat down in the chair, the same chair Emily had sat in, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel it. Not anger, not betrayal, something more complicated. Because part of me had always known this moment would come, that curiosity would eventually outweigh respect, that questions would lead to actions, and that the door would not stay closed forever. But knowing something will happen doesn't make it easy when it does. I looked around the room, at the project I had built piece by piece, at the truth I had carefully documented, and I realized something that settled deep in my chest. They had seen enough. Not everything, but enough. Enough to start asking the right questions. Enough to begin doubting the version of me they had carried for so long. And once doubt begins, it doesn't go away easily. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes for a moment, and in that silence, I thought about what would come next. Because this was the turning point. There was no going back to how things were before. They would ask. They would confront. They would want answers. And I had a choice to make. I could explain. Try to guide them through it gently. Help them understand in pieces. Or I could let them continue. Let them read. Let them discover. Let them sit with the discomfort of not knowing everything all at once. Because sometimes understanding has to be earned, not given. I opened my eyes and reached for the section marked "Not Finished, Not Yet Ready for Them." My fingers rested on the page. They had seen this. I knew they had. And now that phrase meant something different. It wasn't just about readiness anymore. It was about timing, about impact, about truth. Because the final section was not something they could unread. Once they understood it, everything would shift. Not just how they saw me, but how they saw themselves. I stood up slowly, walked to the window, looked out at the quiet street. And for the first time since I had started this project, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. Were they ready? The answer came quickly. No. But they were closer than they had ever been. And maybe that was enough. Downstairs, my phone buzzed. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. Daniel. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it stopped. A moment later, another buzz. Emily. Of course. I turned away from the window, walked back to the desk, picked up the pages they had read, and sat down again. The silence in the room felt different now. Not protected, not hidden, but exposed, and yet strangely calm. Because the truth is, this was never meant to stay a secret forever. It was meant to be found. Just not like this. Not rushed. Not incomplete. I looked at the unfinished section again, then reached for my pen. If they were going to read it, then it needed to be ready. Not perfect, but complete. Because the next time they stepped into this room, or the next time they asked me what I had been doing all this time, I wasn't going to give them half answers anymore. I was going to give them the truth. All of it. Even if it hurt. Especially if it hurt. Because sometimes pain is the only thing that forces people to finally see what has been right in front of them all along. And as I began to write again, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The moment they had opened that door, they hadn't just uncovered a project. They had started something they couldn't stop, and neither could I. They didn't wait long. I had expected a day, maybe two, time for them to process, to sit with what they had seen, to decide how they wanted to approach me. But I underestimated something. Curiosity doesn't fade when it's fed. It grows. Daniel called again that night. I let it go to voicemail. Emily texted, "We need to talk." I didn't respond, not because I was avoiding them, but because I wanted them to come to me, without control, without preparation, without turning this into something they could manage like a conversation about business or logistics. This wasn't that. The next morning, there was a knock on my door. Not soft, not tentative, but not aggressive either, just certain. I opened it. Daniel stood there, Emily beside him, Olivia just behind them, quieter than usual. Jason wasn't there. That told me something immediately. This wasn't about commentary. This was about truth. "Can we come in?" Daniel asked. I stepped aside without answering. They walked in slowly, as if the house felt different now. Maybe it did. We sat in the living room. No one spoke at first, and I didn't rush to fill the silence. Because this time, the silence belonged to them. Emily was the first to break. "We went into your room," she said. Not a question, a confession. "I know," I replied calmly. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me, surprised. "You knew he asked?" I nodded. "You didn't hide it very well." That wasn't entirely true, but I let him sit with it, because it shifted something important. This wasn't about me being caught. This wasn't about me being caught. This was about them realizing they had crossed a line. Emily leaned forward, her voice softer now. "Mom, what is all that?" I held her gaze. "What do you think it is?" She hesitated. A book was about them realizing they had crossed a line. Emily leaned forward, her voice softer now. "Mom, what is all that?" I held her gaze. "What do you think it is?" She hesitated. "A book?" she said, "or something like that." Daniel shook his head slightly. "It's more than that," he said. "There are documents, records, files." "Yes," I said simply. "But why?" Emily pressed. "Why didn't you tell us?" There it was. The question they believed was at the center of everything. "Why didn't you tell us?" I took a slow breath. "Because you never asked," I said. Daniel frowned. "That's not fair." "No," I asked gently. He hesitated, because deep down he knew it was. Emily shook her head. "That's not true, Mom. We ask about you all the time." "No," I said softly. "You ask about the version of me you're comfortable with." Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Daniel leaned forward, his tone sharper now. "Then explain it to us," he said. "Explain what we saw." I looked at him for a long moment. At the impatience. At the need for clarity. At the assumption that answers should come quickly, cleanly on demand. And I realized something. This moment was exactly why I hadn't explained before. Because they still wanted pieces, not the whole. "That room," I said slowly, "is everything you never thought to look at." Emily's eyes filled slightly. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Maybe not," I replied, "but it's true." Daniel exhaled sharply. "We read some of it, I know. It's about us," he said. "Yes." His jaw tightened. "You wrote about things we didn't know." "Yes." Why he demanded. There was frustration in his voice now. Not anger, but something close to it. Because the ground beneath him was shifting, and he didn't like not understanding where to stand. Because those things happened, I said. Emily looked down at her hands. You could have told us, she said quietly. I leaned back slightly. And what would you have done with that information, I asked? She didn't answer, because she didn't have one. Daniel tried. We would have. We would have understood you better. I almost smiled. Would you? I asked. He hesitated, and that hesitation said everything, because understanding requires more than information. It requires willingness, and for years, that willingness hadn't been there. Olivia spoke then, her voice softer than the others. But Grandma, it's not just stories, is it? I looked at her. No, I said, it's not. What is it then? She asked. I paused, because this was the moment, the one where I could choose how much to reveal, and I chose carefully. It's a record, I said, of everything that built this family. Daniel frowned. That doesn't explain the documents. No, I agreed, it doesn't. Emily looked up at me. There were legal papers, she said. Financial records? Yes. Why do you have all of that? I met her gaze. Because I handled all of it. Silence fell again. Different this time. Heavier. Because this wasn't something they could dismiss as emotion or perspective. This was fact. Daniel blinked. What do you mean? I mean, I said calmly, that after your father passed, I made sure everything stayed intact. His expression shifted. You're saying you managed everything? Yes. All the accounts? Yes. The property? Yes. The investments? Yes. Each answer landed like a small shock. Because it contradicted something fundamental they had believed, that I had been passive, that I had been uninvolved, that I had simply existed within the life that had been given to me. But that wasn't true. It had never been true. Emily leaned back slightly, her face pale. We didn't know, she whispered. I know, I said. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Why didn't you tell us that? He asked. I held his gaze. Because you didn't think to ask, I said. And so you didn't think to ask, I said. And this time, he didn't argue, because now he could see it. Not completely, but enough. The edges of a truth that had been there all along. Emily's voice trembled slightly. What else is in there? I looked at her, at the fear, at the curiosity, at the realization that what they had seen was only the beginning. A future, I said quietly. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? It means, I continued, that what you saw isn't just about the past. Their eyes stayed on me, waiting. For once, listening. It's about what happens next, I said, and for the first time since they had walked into that room, they understood something they hadn't before. That this wasn't just a discovery, it was a warning, a preparation, a shift. Because the project they thought was unfinished wasn't incomplete by accident. It was incomplete because they weren't ready, until now. They came back the next day, not separately this time, together. That told me everything I needed to know. Whatever they had seen in that room, it hadn't left them. It had stayed, sat with them, worked its way into the spaces where certainty used to be. I opened the door before they could knock. Daniel looked surprised. Emily didn't. Olivia stood slightly behind them again, quieter, but more aware than before. Come in, I said. They stepped inside, but this time they didn't sit right away. There was a hesitation, a shift in the way they moved through the house, as if they were suddenly aware that they didn't fully understand the space they were standing in. That it wasn't just home anymore, not in the simple way it used to be. Daniel finally spoke. "We read more." I nodded. "I figured you would." Emily crossed her arms, not defensively, but to hold herself steady. "There are things in there, things we didn't know," she said. "Yes." Her voice tightened. "Things you never told us." "Yes." Daniel stepped forward slightly. "That's not normal, Mom," he said. "Families don't hide entire histories from each other." I looked at him calmly. Families don't always ask the right questions either. That stopped him. Not completely, but enough. Emily shook her head. "This isn't about questions," she said. "This is about trust." I held her gaze. "Is it?" I asked gently. Her expression faltered, because now, the ground beneath every assumption they had was unstable. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said. "Then let's stop circling around it. What is all of this really about?" There it was, direct, demanding, the way he had always approached things. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked past them, toward the stairs. I could feel them hesitate behind me, then follow, step by step, until we were standing in front of the door that no longer felt like a barrier, just an entrance. I unlocked it, opened it, and stepped inside. This time, I didn't stop them. They walked in slowly, their eyes moving across the room again, but differently now. Not with curiosity, with awareness, with the understanding that what they were looking at mattered. I moved to the desk, picked up a stack of pages, turned back to them. "This," I said, holding it up slightly, "is where it starts." Daniel stepped closer. Emily stayed where she was. Olivia moved quietly to the side, watching. "It's your story," Daniel said. "No," I replied. "It's the truth." He frowned. "That's the same thing." "No," I said softly, "it isn't." I set the pages down, walked to one of the boxes, opened it, pulled out a folder, and handed it to him. He took it slowly, opened it. His eyes moved quickly at first, scanning, then slower, reading, really reading. Emily moved closer, looked over his shoulder. "What is that?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately, because he had found something he recognized. "These are our accounts," he said. "Yes, but they're organized differently." "Yes." Emily leaned in further. "Why are there notes on them?" she asked. I stepped closer. "Because I tracked everything." Daniel looked up at me. "You mean after Dad passed?" "Yes. All of it, yes." His expression shifted again. Less defensive now, more uncertain. But why, he asked? I held his gaze, but why, he asked? I held his gaze because someone had to. Silence. The kind that forces people to sit with something they don't fully understand yet. Emily spoke next. "There are tea hangs in here about decisions. Because someone had to." Silence. The kind that forces people to sit with something they don't fully understand yet. Emily spoke next. "There are things in here about decisions, investments, transfers," she said. "We never talked about any of this." "No," I agreed. "We didn't." "Why not?" I took a breath. "Because you didn't think I was the one making those decisions." That hit harder than anything else I had said. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. Daniel looked back down at the folder, then at the desk, then around the room. as if trying to piece together a version of reality that didn't match what he had believed for years. Emily's voice softened. "You handled everything?" she asked. "Yes." "All the financial planning?" "Yes." "All the legal structure?" "Yeah." She blinked. "Why didn't we know that?" I met her eyes. "Because you never needed to," I said. And that was the truth. They had lived comfortably, securely, confidently, because I had made sure they could, without ever needing to explain how. Daniel closed the folder slowly. "This isn't just a project," he said. "No," I replied. "What is it then?" I paused, because now we were at the edge of the real answer. "This is everything you never saw," I said, "and everything that's going to matter moving forward." Emily frowned. "What does that mean?" I walked to the desk again, picked up a different section, the one they hadn't fully read yet, the one I had been finishing. "This," I said, placing it in front of them, "is the part you didn't understand." Daniel looked at the pages, then at me. "What is it?" I didn't soften it this time. "It's your future," I said. Silence. Heavy. Immediate. Emily shook her head slightly. "That doesn't make sense." "It will," I said. Daniel picked up the pages. Read the first few lines. His expression changed almost instantly. Not confusion, not curiosity. Something sharper. Something closer to realization. "What is this?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Read it," I said. Emily stepped closer. Olivia leaned in slightly, and as Daniel's eyes moved across the page, the room shifted, because what he was reading wasn't just explanation. It was structure, a plan, a system that had been built quietly, carefully, without their knowledge. This affects everything," he said slowly. "Yes." Emily looked at me, her voice barely above a whisper. "You planned all of this?" "Yes. For us." "Yes." She swallowed hard. "Why didn't you tell us?" I held her gaze. "Because you weren't ready to understand it." Daniel looked up again, and this time there was no dismissal in his eyes, no certainty, no easy answer, just one realization beginning to take shape. That the woman they thought they knew was someone else entirely, and that everything they had believed about her was about to be rewritten. Daniel didn't finish reading the first page before he stopped. Not because he didn't understand the words, but because he understood them too quickly. "This is a trust," he said slowly. "Yes," I replied. Emily's breath caught. "A trust," she repeated. "For what?" I didn't answer her directly. "Keep reading," I said. Daniel did, this time slower, more carefully. The confidence he usually carried, the certainty, the control, it was slipping piece by piece, replaced by something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. "This isn't just assets," he said. "It's structured. Conditions, clauses." He looked up at me. "You built this?" "Yes." "When?" "Over the last few years." His brows pulled together. "With who? A lawyer? Why didn't we know about this?" I held his gaze. "Because you didn't think you needed to." That answer hit differently now. Because it wasn't defensive. It was reflective. Emily stepped forward, her voice tighter. "What kind of conditions?" she asked. Daniel flipped to the next page. His eyes scanned quickly, then slowed, then stopped. "What is it?" Emily pressed. He didn't answer right away. And that silence, that hesitation. It was louder than anything he could have said. "Daniel," she insisted. He exhaled. It's about how the assets are distributed," he said carefully. "But not equally, not automatically." Emily's face tightened. "What do you mean, not automatically?" He hesitated again, because now he was reading something that challenged more than just assumptions. It challenged expectations. "It's conditional," he said finally. Conditional on what Daniel looked at me, as if asking for permission. Or maybe as if hoping I would take over. But I didn't, because this was part of what they needed to see for themselves. He swallowed. "On behavior," he said. Silence. Thick. Immediate. Emily blinked. "What?" "There are clauses," he continued, "about financial responsibility, about decisions, about accountability." Her voice rose slightly. "You're saying Mom set rules for us, for our own inheritance." I didn't flinch. "I set protections," I said. "That's not the same thing." "It is," I replied calmly, "when you've seen what happens without them." Daniel turned another page. His expression darkened slightly. "There are also restrictions," he said. Emily let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Restrictions," she repeated. "Are you serious?" He didn't respond, because he was still reading, and what he was seeing was making it impossible for him to dismiss it. "There's a clause about joint decisions," he said slowly. "Certain assets can't be sold unless both of us agree." Emily crossed her arms. "That makes sense." "There's more," he added. She looked at him. "What?" He hesitated, then said it. "There's a clause about misuse." Her expression changed. "What kind of misuse?" Daniel didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't simple, and it wasn't comfortable. "Financial instability," he said finally. "Reckless decisions, significant debt, things like that." Emily stared at him, then at me. "You don't trust us?" she asked. The question was sharp, direct, and underneath it, there was something deeper, fear. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple. "It's not about trust," I said quietly. "Then what is it about I stepped closer, so that what your father and I built doesn't disappear because of choices made too quickly?" Daniel looked up sharply. "You think we destroy it?" "I think I said carefully that you've both made decisions before without understanding the full impact." Emily's eyes filled slightly. "That's not fair." "No," I said softly. "It's honest." Silence. Again. But this time, it wasn't defensive. It was reflective, because they both knew what I meant, even if they didn't want to admit it out loud. Daniel flipped further. "There's also something else," he said. "What?" Emily asked. He paused, then looked at me. "This isn't just about money." "No," I said. "What is it then?" I took a breath. "This is about understanding." Emily frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "It will," I said. Daniel found another section. His eyes narrowed slightly. "What is this?" he asked. He was holding the part I had spent the most time on, the one I had rewritten more than any other, the one that connected everything, that I said quietly is the reason. He read, slowly, carefully. And as he did, his expression changed again. Not confusion, not frustration, something deeper, something heavier. "Mom," he said under his breath. Emily stepped closer. "What is it?" He didn't answer, because what he was reading wasn't about structure, or conditions, or legal language. It was about truth, the kind that doesn't hide behind technical terms, the kind that doesn't soften itself to make people comfortable. the kind that shows people exactly who they were and who they chose to be. It's everything, he said quietly. Emily took the pages from him. Read. And within seconds, her face broke. Not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. Because she saw it too. The moments she had forgotten. The things she had never asked about. The ways she had spoken. The assumptions she had made. All written clearly. Not exaggerated. Not cruel. Just there. "Why would you write this?" she whispered. I looked at her. "Because it happened," I said. Tears filled her eyes. "You could have told us." "I tried," I said softly, in the ways I knew how. Daniel looked up at me. His voice was different now, quieter, less certain. "This isn't just a project," he said. "No," I replied. "It's a record." "Yes, of us. Yes." He swallowed. "And the trust, the plan, all of it?" "It only makes sense," I said, "if you understand this first." Silence fell again, but this time it wasn't filled with resistance. It was filled with realization, because for the first time, they weren't just looking at what I had done, they were starting to see why. And that was the part that would change everything. The room didn't feel the same anymore. Not to them, and not to me, because something had shifted, irreversibly. Daniel was still holding the pages, but he wasn't reading anymore. His eyes were fixed on the same paragraph as if his mind was trying to catch up with something his instincts had already understood. Emily had stepped back slightly, her arms no longer crossed. They hung loosely at her sides like she had forgotten how to hold herself together. Olivia, she hadn't moved, but her expression had changed. She wasn't confused anymore. She was listening, truly listening, and that mattered more than anything. "This isn't what we thought," Daniel said quietly. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a statement meant for me. It was something he was saying to himself. "No," I replied. "It isn't." Emily let out a slow breath. "We thought," she began, then stopped, because finishing that sentence would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to say out loud. I didn't help her, because this part, they had to reach on their own. Daniel looked around the room again, not scanning this time, not analyzing, seeing. "These boxes, all of this, you've been doing this for years." "Yes, and we didn't know anything about it." "No," he swallowed, "not even a little." "No." That silence again. But now it was different. It wasn't defensive. It was heavy with realization. Emily wiped at her eyes quickly, almost angrily. "Why didn't we see it?" she asked. The question came out sharper than she intended, but underneath it was something raw. I stepped closer. "Because you weren't looking for it," I said gently. She shook her head. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, because now she was remembering the times she had walked into this house and only noticed what was familiar. The times she had asked about me, but only in ways that confirmed what she already believed. The times she had filled in the gaps instead of questioning them. Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter now. "We thought you were done." I nodded. "I know, but you weren't." "No, you were building this." "Yes." He looked down at the pages again. "And all of this, it's connected." "Yes." Emily looked up at me. "There are things in there about sacrifices, about choices, things we never knew." "I know. Why didn't you tell us those things when they were happening?" I paused, because that question deserved an honest answer. Because at the time I said slowly, "You needed stability more than you needed explanation. She blinked. I don't understand. I took a breath. When you were younger, when things were uncertain when your father passed, you didn't need to carry the weight of those decisions. Daniel frowned slightly. So you just handled it? Yes. Alone? Yes. That word hung in the air. Alone. Not dramatic, not emphasized, but undeniable. Emily's voice softened. We didn't know, she said. I know, I replied. Daniel stepped closer. And now? He asked. Why tell us now? I met his eyes. Because now you're part of what happens next. That shifted something again. Because this wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about responsibility. Emily shook her head slightly. This feels like we missed something important. I didn't correct her, because she was right. Daniel let out a slow breath. We did miss something. Neither of them spoke for a moment. And in that silence, I could see it happening. Not all at once, but piece by piece. The image they had carried of me was breaking apart. And in its place, something more complex was forming, something harder to define, but closer to the truth. Emily looked around the room again, at the boxes, at the desk, at the pages. This isn't just about us, is it? She asked. No, I said. What else is there? I walked to the shelf, picked up one of the folders they hadn't touched yet, and handed it to her. She took it slowly, opened it. Her eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then the third. What is this? She asked. Letters, I said. From who? Your father. Her breath caught. She looked up at me. You kept all of these? Yes. Why didn't you ever show us? I smiled faintly. Because they weren't written for you, I said. That answer surprised her. She looked back down at the pages. Read more carefully this time. And as she did, her expression softened, not with sadness, but with understanding. Daniel stepped closer, looking over her shoulder. What do they say? He asked. She didn't answer right away, because what she was reading wasn't just memory. It was perspective. Your father knew the letters said in ways both direct and subtle. He knew what I had given up. He knew what I had carried. He knew who I was beyond the roles I played, and he trusted me. Not just to care for the family, but to guide it, to protect it, to make the decisions that would matter long after he was gone. Emily looked up slowly. He trusted you with everything, she said. Yes. Daniel frowned slightly. And we just assumed. He didn't finish. Because now, he didn't need to. Olivia spoke quietly. I didn't think you stopped, she said. We all looked at her. She shifted slightly under the attention. I just thought you were waiting. I smiled at her. That's closer, I said. Daniel looked at her. Waiting for what? She hesitated, then said it. For us to notice. She shifted slightly under the attention. I just thought you were waiting. I smiled at her. That is closer, I said. Daniel looked at her. Waiting for what? She hesitated, then said it. For us to notice. Silence fell again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't painful. It was clear, because in that simple sentence, she had said what the rest of them were only beginning to understand. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't disappeared. I hadn't become less. I had simply waited. Waited for them to see what had always been there. And now they were starting to. Not completely. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to begin the hardest part. Accepting it. It didn't happen all at once. That kind of realization never does. It builds. Quietly. Piece by piece. Like a crack spreading through glass. You don't always hear it at first, but eventually you can't ignore what's breaking. Emily sat down slowly in the chair again, the same one she had taken before. But this time, she didn't look at the pages right away. She looked at me. Really looked. Not at the version of me she had carried for years, but at the woman standing in front of her now. "I don't know how to talk to you," she said softly. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't expected resistance, but because I hadn't expected vulnerability. "You can start by being honest," I said. Her eyes filled again. "I thought I was," she whispered. I stepped closer. "No," I said gently. "You were being certain." That landed. Daniel let out a slow breath, running his hand through his hair again, something he did when he was trying to process more than he could control. "This whole time," he said quietly, "we thought we understood you." I didn't respond, because that part wasn't something I needed to correct. Emily laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "I told people you had a simple life," she said, "that you were content." I met her gaze. "And what did that mean to you?" She hesitated. "That you didn't want more," she said. "And now," her voice broke slightly, "now I don't think I ever asked what you wanted." "And what did that mean to you?" She hesitated. "That you didn't want more," she said. "And now," her voice broke slightly, "now I don't think I ever asked what you wanted." Silence, not heavy this time, but exposed, because that sentence, it held everything. Daniel looked at the pages in his hand again. "There's a part here," he said slowly, about when I almost lost my first job. I nodded. "I remember." His brow furrowed. "No, you remember what I told you?" he said. "This says something different." I didn't look away, because there was more to it. He swallowed. "What do you mean?" I took a breath. "You were about to make a decision that would have cost you everything I said. Not just your job, your reputation, your future." His expression tightened. "I fixed it," I said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Daniel stared at me. "You what?" "I stepped in," I said, quietly. How he asked his voice sharper now. "Through someone I knew," I replied. "Through information you didn't have yet." He shook his head slightly. "That doesn't make a sense. I handled that situation myself." How he asked his voice sharper now. "Through someone I knew," I replied. "Through information you didn't have yet." He shook his head slightly. "That doesn't make sense. I handled that situation myself." I held his gaze. "No," I said, softly. "You recovered from it, but you didn't stop it." Silence. The kind that doesn't argue. The kind that settles. Because deep down, he knew there had been something. Something he couldn't fully explain at the time. Something that had shifted in his favor without effort. "That was you?" he asked quietly. "Yes." He looked down again, not at the pages, but at his own hands, as if trying to understand how much of his life had been shaped by things he never saw. Emily spoke again, her voice fragile now. "There's something here about my college tuition," she said. I nodded. "I paid for it." She shook her head. "No, I had loans." "Yes," I said. "You had loans, but you also had gaps." She blinked. "What gaps? The ones you didn't see?" I said. Her voice trembled. "You mean the semesters I thought were covered?" "Yes." Her lips parted slightly. "You covered them?" "Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her gently. "Because you needed to feel like you were doing it yourself," I said. "And you were, just not completely alone." Tears slipped down her cheeks now. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. "I thought you didn't understand what I was going through," she whispered. "I understood more than you realized." Daniel exhaled slowly. "This changes everything," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It makes everything we said, everything we assumed he didn't finish, because he didn't need to." Emily wiped her face, shaking her head. "I called you comfortable," she said, "like you just settled." I didn't respond, because that word, it had stayed with me for a long time. "I thought you stopped trying," she added. I looked at her. "I didn't stop," I said quietly. "I just stopped doing it where you could see." That hit harder than anything else. Because now they understood what that meant. All those years, all those quiet decisions, all those unseen efforts. Not absence, not failure, just invisibility. Daniel looked around the room again. "This project," he said slowly, "it's not just for us, is it?" "No," I said. "It's for you too." "Yes, and you needed it," he added. I nodded. "I needed to remember who I was," I said. Silence fell again, but this time it was filled with something new. Respect. Not complete, not fully formed, but present. Emily stood up slowly, walked toward me, and for a moment she didn't say anything. She just looked at me, as if she was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person, the one she had known, and the one she was only now beginning to see. "I'm sorry," she said finally. The words were simple, but they were real. I didn't rush to accept them, not out of punishment, but because this wasn't a moment that could be resolved that quickly. "I know," I said softly. Daniel stepped forward next, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "I was wrong," he said. I looked at him. "You were certain?" I replied. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, and that was the problem. Olivia stepped closer then. She didn't say anything. She just reached for my hand and held it, and somehow that felt like the most honest response of all. Because she hadn't built a version of me she needed to defend. She had simply waited to understand. And now, so were they. But understanding was only the beginning, because what came next would require something even harder: change. The room felt quieter after that, not because no one was speaking, but because for the first time, no one was rushing to fill the silence with certainty. We moved downstairs slowly, not as a group walking together in rhythm, but as individuals trying to adjust to something new, something unfamiliar, something real. Daniel stayed near the back, his mind still clearly turning over everything he had read. Emily walked ahead of me, but her steps had lost that usual confidence, like she wasn't entirely sure where she stood anymore. Olivia stayed beside me. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Back in the living room, no one immediately sat down. It was Daniel who finally broke the stillness. "What happens now?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried everything. Not just curiosity, responsibility. I looked at him. At what point, I asked. He frowned slightly. With all of it, he said, "The project, the trust, everything you've built." I nodded slowly. "It continues," I said. Emily shook her head slightly. "You're just going to keep working on it." "Yes, like nothing changed." I met her eyes. "Everything changed," I said. "You're just starting to feel it." That landed quietly. Because she knew it was true. Daniel crossed his arms, but not defensively this time. More like he was trying to hold himself steady. "And us," he asked, "what are we supposed to do?" There it was again. That instinct to look for direction, for structure, for something clear. I didn't give it to him. "You decide who you want to be in this story," I said. He blinked. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that matters." Emily sat down slowly on the couch. "This feels like a test," she said. "It's not a test," I replied. "Then what is it?" I took a breath. "It's an opportunity," I said. She let out a small, shaky laugh. "That doesn't feel any better." "I know." Silence settled again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Daniel moved closer, his voice quieter now. "If we hadn't opened that door," he said. I looked at him. "You would have eventually," I replied. He shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "We wouldn't have." I didn't argue, because deep down, he was probably right. Emily looked up at me. "Would you have ever told us?" she asked. I paused, because that answer mattered. "Yes," I said. When you were ready to hear it." She frowned. "And how would you have known that I held her gaze?" "The same way I knew you weren't ready before." She looked down. Because now, that made sense. In a way, it never had before. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This changes how I see everything," he said. "It should," I replied. He looked at me again. "And you?" he asked. "How do you see us now?" Because now, that made sense. In a way, it never had before. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This changes how I see everything," he said. "It should," I replied. He looked at me again. "And you?" he asked. "How do you see us now?" That question, it wasn't easy, but it was honest, and it deserved the same in return. "I see you as you are," I said. Emily's voice was soft. "And what does that mean?" "It means I see your strengths," I said. "Your intelligence, your independence, your ability to build your own lives." Daniel nodded slightly. "And I didn't soften it." "And I see where you've been careless," I said. "Where you've made assumptions instead of asking questions. Where you've judged instead of understanding." Emily swallowed hard. "That's fair." Daniel didn't argue, because now, they weren't trying to defend themselves. They were listening, really listening. I stepped closer. "But I also see something else," I said. They both looked at me. "What?" Emily asked. "Change," I said. The words settled between us. Quiet, but powerful. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. You think we can change? He asked. I think you already are, I replied. Emily wiped at her eyes again. I don't want to be the person I was in those pages, she said. You're not, I said. She looked at me confused. But I said those things. Yes, I believe those things. Yes. Then how am I not that person? I stepped closer. Because now you see them, I said. That answer didn't erase anything, but it gave her something else. Perspective. Daniel nodded slowly. That makes sense, he said. He paused, then added, I don't like what I saw either. You're not supposed to, I said. Silence again, but lighter now. Not resolved, but moving. Olivia spoke softly. Can I help you? She asked. We all looked at her, with the project she added. I smiled at her. You already are, I said. She tilted her head slightly. How? By seeing it, I replied. By seeing it, I replied. That seemed to satisfy her. Daniel glanced toward the stairs. Can we read more? He asked. I studied him for a moment, not judging, not testing, just seeing. Yes, I said finally. Emily looked surprised. Really? Yes. Oh, satisfy her. Daniel glanced toward the stairs. Can we read more? He asked. I studied him for a moment, not judging, not testing, just seeing. Yes, I said finally. Emily looked surprised. Really? Yes. Even the parts we haven't seen yet? I nodded, but this time I said, you don't read it like a discovery. How do we read it? Daniel asked. I held his gaze. You read it like it matters. Because that was the difference. Before they had walked into that room out of curiosity. Now they would walk into it with awareness, with responsibility, with the understanding that what they were reading wasn't just about me. It was about them, about who they had been, and who they still had time to become. Emily stood up slowly. Daniel followed. Olivia stayed close, and together we moved back toward the stairs. Not as strangers, not as people trying to prove something, but as a family, finally learning how to see each other clearly, and for the first time. That felt like something worth finishing. We didn't rush it. That was the difference. In the past, everything between us had been quick assumptions, quick judgments, quick conclusions. But this unfolded slowly, over days, then weeks. They came back often after that. Not as visitors, not as guests, but as people returning to something they had only just begun to understand. Sometimes we sat together in that room, reading, not speaking much, just turning pages, letting the words do what explanations never had. Daniel approached it the way he approached everything at first, structured, analytical, trying to connect every detail into something logical. But I watched him change, gradually. He stopped skimming, stopped searching for conclusions, and started reading, really reading, not just the documents, but the moments, the choices, the things he had lived through but never seen from the outside. One afternoon, he sat back in the chair and said quietly, I didn't realize how much you carried. I didn't respond right away, because that sentence, it wasn't something that needed to be answered. It needed to be felt. Emily was different. She didn't try to organize it. She felt it, all of it, sometimes too much. There were days she couldn't finish a chapter. Days when she would close the folder and just sit there, her eyes distant, her mind somewhere between memory and realization. "I wish I had asked more," she said once. "You're asking now," I replied. She nodded, but there was still that weight in her voice. "That doesn't change what I didn't do." "No," I said gently, "but it changes what you can do next." Olivia stayed consistent, curious, open. She asked questions not to challenge, but to understand. "Why did you write this part this way?" she would ask. "Because that's how it felt," I'd answer. "Did it hurt?" "Yes." "Why didn't you say something then?" I would smile. "Because not everything needs to be said in the moment to be true." And she would nod, as if that made perfect sense to her. In a way it did, because she hadn't spent years building a version of me she needed to protect. She just saw what was there. The project itself began to change too. Not in structure, not in purpose, but in energy. It was no longer something I carried alone. It had become something we moved through together, carefully, respectfully, honestly. The final section, the one I had left unfinished for so long, was the hardest. Not because I didn't know what to write, but because I knew what it meant. It wasn't just about explaining the trust or outlining the future. It was about closure, about saying everything that hadn't been said, about putting into words what had been lived in silence. I worked on it at night, as I always had, but now the door stayed unlocked. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. One evening, Emily came in quietly while I was writing. She didn't interrupt. She just stood there for a moment, watching. "Can I read it?" she asked softly. I paused, looked at the page, then at her. "It's not finished," I said. She nodded. "I know." I hesitated, then turned the notebook slightly toward her. She stepped closer, read, slowly, carefully. And as she did, I watched her face, not for reaction, but for understanding. When she finished, she looked up at me. Her eyes were full but steady. "You don't hate us," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. Even after everything, I shook my head. "This was never about hate," I said. "It was about being seen." She swallowed. "We didn't see you?" "No," I agreed. "You didn't." She nodded slowly. "But we do now." I held her gaze. "Yes," I said. "You do." That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, but complete. Because everything that had been building had finally landed. The project was finished a few days later. Not published, not shared with the world, but completed, exactly the way it was meant to be. We didn't celebrate it, not in the traditional sense. There was no announcement, no ceremony, just a quiet evening, the four of us sitting together, the final pages resting on the table between us. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. "So this is it," he said. "Yes, this is everything." The four of us sitting together, the final pages resting on the table between us. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. "So this is it," he said. "Yes. This is everything, yes." He nodded slowly. "It's more than I expected." I smiled faintly. "It was always more than you thought." Emily reached out and touched the pages gently. "It's not just a story," she said. "No," I replied. "It's us." I nodded. "Yes." Olivia looked between all of us. "It's also you," she said, looking at me. I smiled. "Yes, I said. It is. And that mattered, because for the first time, they didn't just see the parts of me that fit into their lives. They saw the whole, the past, the choices, the silence, the strength, the things I had built without needing recognition. And the truth is, I didn't need it anymore. Not in the way I once thought I did. Because this moment, this understanding, it was enough. Daniel leaned back slightly.
I used to think you gave up.
He said. I looked at him.
I know.
He shook his head.
You didn't.
No, I said.
You just kept it going in a way we couldn't see.
Yes.
I used to think you gave up, he said.
I looked at him.
I know.
He shook his head.
You didn't.
No, I said.
You just kept going in a way we couldn't see.
Yes. Emily smiled faintly through her tears. That's kind of powerful. I let out a soft breath. It's just life, I said. But maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was proof that not all dreams are loud. Not all strength is visible. And not all unfinished things are abandoned. Some are just waiting for the right moment, the right understanding, the right people to finally see them clearly. And when they do, they don't just change how you're seen. They change everything. After everything Frances Millbrook experienced, one truth became impossible to ignore. Being misunderstood doesn't mean you are invisible. It simply means your story hasn't been fully seen yet. For years, she carried the weight of silence of assumptions of being reduced to something smaller than who she truly was. But instead of fighting to be heard in every moment, she chose something harder. She built something undeniable. Her story reminds us that not all strength is loud. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is continue quietly, consistently, and with purpose until the truth speaks for itself. Family, too, is not just about shared history. It's about shared understanding. And that understanding doesn't always come easily. It requires humility, reflection, and the willingness to admit when we've been wrong. So let me ask you, have you ever been misunderstood by the people closest to you? Have you ever felt like your story was never fully seen? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are more stories like this, stories about truth growth and second chances, waiting for you. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones we almost never tell.